Alright, so before starting this video, this is a follow-up video to that one video I made about how to fix that Windows Update error with that Windows Recovery Update. Now, in this video I talk about 5 of the most common issues, as well as a couple isolated issues and what might be the issue, and then a couple questions people also had in the comments. So anyways, if you've not seen that first video on how to fix the update error and you are experiencing the error, I believe the link in the description as well as a card right here that you could just click on and go watch that video first. And if you run into any problems, then you could head back to this video and see if there's any fixes. Also, if your particular fix isn't working, I actually recommend watching the whole video because maybe some of the fixes from some of the others may end up helping you. So if any of these fixes don't work and your fix is not listed, feel free to leave a comment. I'll personally help you out. But anyways, let's start off with the video. Hello guys, it's Julia here, and I'm back with a quick follow-up video on fixing this Windows Update error, which is 0x80070643. Some people in the comments had like the same problems, and I wanted to go over the 5 most common problems and how to fix them, as this video will make it much easier instead of having to reply to every comment with the fix, because as you know, some people have slightly different configurations and it won't be exactly the same as my guide in some scenarios. So I'm going to go over 5 most common issues. Now the first issue is people either having the recovery partition at the very beginning of their drive instead of after their OS drive, which causes some problems with the process, as well as having extra recovery partitions. So I'm going to go over that. However, first we're going to, as you can see, we have the update error. We go to update history. Yep, it's KB 5034441, failing with the same error code, as you could see. And we're going to open a CMD with admin. Now, I even recommend this before you even do anything. I recommend doing regentc/info, because for all you know, your recovery might just be disabled. Because for some people that have this update fail, it's actually because the recovery might just be disabled. It might not necessarily be because they need to resize it, because the recovery environment has to be enabled in order to install this update. So if it's enabled and it's failing, then yeah, you're going to need to resize it. If it's disabled, you can just do regent/enable, which will enable it if it's disabled, and then retry it again. If it still fails, then we need to resize it. So I'm in one of the scenarios, as you can see, it's enabled, it's failing. So then I'm going to go to disk part, actually I didn't disable it first. I might want to disable it first. So let me actually exit. So regentc/disable, because obviously we have to disable it. Then I'll go to disk part. So I'm acting like I'm following the guide here. And then I'm going to list the disks, select disk 0, list partition. And as you can see, this is a problem. Recovery is partition 1 and not partition 4 or whatever, like it normally is, and like it was in my video. So if I go to disk management, which let me open disk management right now, you guys can see that my recovery is here and not where it needs to be. So you're probably like, okay, what do I do if my recovery is here instead of here? Well, I'm just going to show you guys a quick and easy fix. So first, we're going to actually select partition 1, and then we're just going to delete it. So now we no longer have a recovery partition. We have this unallocated. Then we're going to shrink the C drive. So then we're going to select partition 4, and then we're going to run the shrink command. Okay guys, so we're going to shrink by 750. I spelt it wrong before by accident, so always be careful of typos if you get errors like this, because I know some people also got errors trying to do stuff. Double check what you wrote and make sure you typed it correctly, please, because that could also be problems. I've seen some of those in the comments as well. So we're going to shrink by 750 because that's normally how big it would normally be. So instead of the 250, we need to go higher, because as you can see, we're going to make this a recovery. And then after you do that, as you know, you need to make sure your disk is GPT or MBR. So you can see we have the star for GPT. So we're going to, again, follow the GPT commands for creating the partition. And you just got to do it like normal. So you can see I did that. I'm just copying and pasting them because it's making it quicker for the video. And then if I exit this part, you'll see we now have a recovery at the end of the drive, and we still have this 500 unallocated. Now, if you want to get rid of this, unfortunately, you have to use a third-party partition program to move the partitions around. So then maybe you can have this unallocated be right after C and in between the recovery, and then extend C afterwards. However, I don't recommend using third-party partition apps unless you have a backup of your system, because I have seen them mess up before. In fact, my entire file system corrupted before when shrinking my partition once back in like 2019. So I always say I'm weary about partition apps, but if you know what you're doing, feel free to do that. But it's only 500 megabytes, so if you're really that worried about it, you can proceed with using a partition app. The one I would honestly use is like Gparted or something, but that requires booting an ISO, and it's Linux based, and it's actually probably one of the like best free ones that you can use. But I know some people may find other ones easier because you could do it all within the operating system without needing to do that, because it'll want to reboot and then it'll do it on reboot and all that with some other apps. So anyways, now we're going to enable recovery. So we're going to re-enable it, and it should work. So as you guys can see, we re-enabled our recovery. So then if I up arrow and we go to the info now, you can see it's enabled on still partition 1. That can't be. This is weird. You guys could see it's here, but it still says partition 1. So let's see if this works, because I think it might be confused. But in theory, this should work. So I think it's just confused and thinks it's still on partition 1, but you can see it's clearly not because it's unallocated and that we moved it. So let's hope that the update still installs. Alright guys, it succeeded, I think, because it just finished, and yep, the update finally succeeded. The KB5034441 successfully installed, and we now have a recovery partition at the end of the drive instead of the beginning. So you can do that, and that will fix it. Just don't worry about the unallocated, because like I said, I don't really recommend partition apps, and Windows unfortunately will not let us move this because it's at the beginning. And I don't think you need a 500 megabyte partition. There's not much you can do with a 500 megabyte partition. So it's best to just leave it the way it is if you want to be simple about it. Alright, so I'm adding this on. If you open disk management and you notice you have more than one recovery partition, because this is another scenario, or maybe you have one at the beginning and some at the end, I recommend deleting them and recreating it and making sure it's at least 750 megabytes. But in my case, this 560 megabyte partition somehow was able to install the update. I don't know how, but I guess I got lucky or something. But in my case, I'm just going to delete this partition and then re-extend it and keep this one. But obviously first, we need to even see which one it's using for the recovery. Hopefully this one and not the other one, but I'm not sure because I didn't check. You can see it's enabled. It tells you where. So it says partition 5. It may or may not be that one. I'm not sure. So let's do disk part, list, disk. And here it's disk 3 for me. So that's another thing. Make sure you always select the right disk. Select disk 3 and then list partition. And you could see that, yeah, it is indeed using the recovery from partition 5. It's not even using partition 4. So I'm just going to select partition 4. And I'm going to delete it. So now you can see the other recovery is gone. So then I can just right click this, extend, go through this process, next, finish. And now I only have one recovery partition instead of having multiple. Now, if this was stored on the smaller partition and you're still having issues, like I said, just be sure you disable recovery first with the disable command, delete all of them, use the commands to recreate it, and then enable it again and see if it allows you to update. And also another thing, if you have like another partition at the end, like another recovery, and it's like really big, like it's like 10 gigs or something, or whatever, I would leave it be because that's most likely your factory image, and you don't want to lose the factory image to your computer, and you don't want to like delete any super large recovery partitions that are like over 5 gigs, because it probably means it's that, and that just stores the factory image, not necessarily the Windows recovery always. So yeah. And another thing, if you have another recovery on another disk, that will cause a problem, because I know sometimes, like, I had someone that had 2 drives in their computer and they had 2 Windows installs, and they weren't able to like enable the recovery properly because of that. It like wouldn't work. Like, they weren't able to do it. I forget what happened, but it didn't work. And after they had formatted that other disk because they didn't need anything on it, they were able to actually enable the recovery properly, and it didn't have any issues. So be sure you don't have any recovery partitions on any other drive, otherwise you might run into some problems. So that's that. Alright, so another common error that people would get is when re-enabling the recovery after following the steps, they would get the Windows RE image was not found. Now, I actually found the cause to the problem, or the most common cause as to why it could be happening. So if you don't disable your Windows recovery before you delete the partition and all of that, you tend to get this error, because that's how I triggered it. There may be other ways it gets triggered, but I know if you don't disable the recovery first with the reagentc/disable command, that it breaks everything. My guess is probably because it doesn't put the Windows RE image somewhere, and then it gets lost when the partition gets deleted. So thankfully there is a fix for it, which is to grab the winre.wim from a Windows 10 ISO, or I can give you a link to the one from my ISO, which I might leave in the description. It's just the one from my Windows 10 22H2 ISO. I extracted it, but I'm also showing you guys how to grab the file out of your ISO if you do download one or you want to download one. But you can download a Windows 10 ISO from Microsoft with the media creation tool. There is an option to create installation media, which later I'll actually open the MCT for something. So you guys will see where that option is if you want to download an ISO and then use the winre.wim from that in order to fix it. Alright, so I've seen a few people run into this issue, which is when you try to shrink your primary OS partition and it says the volume that you selected to shrink may be corrupted, and to use check disk to fix the corruption. It's as simple as running a check disk on your main drive. Now, this is what I would recommend doing. I would recommend rebooting and see if it runs check disk automatically, because usually in most scenarios like this, it'll automatically run a check disk at startup if it detects a problem. However, if you reboot and it does not, then there's a command you can run to trigger a check disk. Now, this is for a full check disk that does all the stages. I highly recommend doing this if your disk is corrupted, as it makes sure that the disk is fully fine. It even checks for bad sectors if it's a hard drive, and it does a pretty good job at that. However, most likely it's just your file system is corrupt and then it just needs to be repaired. And having a corrupt file system can cause other issues too. So obviously do this if your drive is reporting it might be corrupted. And after you run the check disk, you should be able to go back and shrink the partition again, and it should let you go and proceed with it. So, very simple fix. Alright, so this error has also been very common, and it's when you try to shrink your partition and it says that the specified shrink size is too big and will cause the volume to be smaller than the minimum volume size. This is a very weird issue where Windows just won't let you shrink your drive at all, and I don't know why this happens. I think it's because files get in the way and it physically can't shrink. And even running an optimize, which is like a defrag, but I know on SSDs it does trim, seems to not work for whatever reason, and it's just a really stupid issue. So in scenarios like this where you just can't shrink at all, I recommend just putting your recovery on your C drive, because you can actually store the winre.wim on the C drive and it will let you. So here I'm showing you guys how to do that. Now the partitions might be different for you guys, but essentially what you're going to do is you're going to capture the WIM of your recovery partition, so that way you have a copy of it, and then you're going to apply it to your C partition. Now this won't like overwrite anything, so don't worry. And then you're going to set your recovery location to use that instead. And then after you do that, you'll be able to then re-enable recovery, and it should enable on your OS drive, and then you should be able to install the update successfully. And you can feel free to delete the normal recovery partition after that, because it's not needed anymore since you moved it to your C drive. Now, unfortunately, that was the only solution I could come up with for this issue, because Windows just makes it impossible to shrink sometimes, and it's just the easiest solution. If you guys come up with another solution, feel free to leave a comment, because I've not been able to figure out how to get this to actually let you shrink, and anyone that's experienced this, I just directed them to move it to their C drive, and it worked like a charm. Now, if you're having issues or you don't have a recovery partition, I can give you a winre.wim from my virtual machine that I captured from the recovery partition. You can feel free to leave a comment and I'll give it to you, and you can use that to apply it to C, meaning you'll go straight to the apply image and not have to worry about capturing the image or mounting the recovery partition at all. And it should work. So any other questions, feel free to leave a comment. Feel free to contact any of the social medias I also will leave below in this video too, if you run into any issues or have any questions. Okay, just so I don't confuse you guys, winre.wim is actually stored in the recovery partition itself. However, the WIM I just created in this video is a WIM of the recovery partition, which also contains that other WIM file. So I actually have two WIM files, the recovery partition WIM itself and the winre.wim that you would put in that one location if you're getting that winre image not found, as that image is required so that it can put it in the recovery. So if you're still having trouble installing this update or trying any of these methods to try and fix it, and you're still getting errors and saying like the step you're trying to do isn't working, this is what you need to do next. So first, obviously, disable your recovery. Delete the partition, because we are going to do an in-place upgrade on Windows 10, and that'll recreate it. So we obviously need to re-extend our space back to our C drive, so that way we have no recovery. And when we go to download Windows 10 from Microsoft's website and then run their media creation tool, there'll be an option to actually upgrade once we run this tool, and you guys will see here in the video. It also has an option to create installation media, so that's another way that you can be able to download the ISO if you need to get like that winre.wim, for example, that we talked about earlier in this video. But here we're just going to do the upgrade. It's nice and simple. If you want to do the create installation media, you can, because it'll let you download the ISO, and you can also mount that ISO by double clicking on it and run setup.exe, and that will also do the same thing, but you'll just have the ISO file for Windows 10, which might come in handy in the future. But for this video, I'm just showing the upgrade option. You can see right here it says to install and to keep personal files and apps. Make sure it says that, because if it's not going to keep your files, there's clearly a problem, and obviously this should not delete your data, this should not delete your files, this should be a nice and smooth upgrade process. So here you're seeing a time-lapse of the in-place upgrade, aka repair install, as that's another term for it. I actually made a video a while back on this. It's pretty much the same thing as that, as it hasn't changed. So as you guys can see in disk management, our recovery partition has came back, and you can see when I open WinVer, it's an older version than what we had previously, so I'm running Windows Update to get fully up to date. However, the recovery update fails again, so I'll just go through the same process as I did in the first video I made, which is deleting the recovery partition and then shrinking the main OS partition. I think I did it a little bit backwards in this, but it doesn't matter the order, it'll still get the same result in the end. But you guys will see it's pretty much just the same steps from that first video, which you guys should definitely check out if you stumbled across this video first and didn't see that video. But this video is definitely very helpful for people that had those error messages and just couldn't get it to work. If you still can't get it to work, feel free to contact any of my social medias below. I will personally help you with any issues you may encounter when installing this update or any questions you may have. But that is pretty much a last resort, other than the very, very last resort is to reinstall Windows, and I'm sure most people don't want to do that, and there probably is another fix. But you guys can see I got it to install successfully here, and this VM is good to go. Oh yeah, one last thing. I would recommend going to Settings, System, Storage, and then click on your temporary files for your C drive and check everything except downloads. That way you can clear your previous version of Windows, as when you do a in-place upgrade, aka repair install, it creates a Windows.old, which takes up like probably 20 gigs of space. So if you want to get your space back, highly recommended to do this afterwards, and yeah. Well, another thing you could do if this even fails, if your computer supports Windows 11, you could just make the move to Windows 11, because Windows 11 does have a larger recovery partition by default. I believe it recreates one as like 800 megabytes or something like that. But I know not a lot of people like Windows 11, but it is another option out there for the people who just want to decide to upgrade to Windows 11. So that also is an option too, if you do want to proceed with that route. Alright guys, so I'm going to go over 3 of the most common questions really quickly, and then afterwards go over a couple comments. Now, question number 1. Can you make the recovery partition the original size again after you get the update installed? I believe you might be able to, however, who knows if the winre.wim grew in size. I'm sure it definitely did from this update, and even though you probably can disable the recovery, repeat the steps to recreate the partition smaller and re-enable it after the update, and it probably will work. Who knows if Microsoft will push another recovery update and then you'll have the same exact problem again and have to resize it again. So honestly, even though it might be possible and it might work, I would just leave it alone. I've not actually tried it to verify if you can. However, like I said, just leave it be. You never know with Microsoft. Question number 2, what if you don't have a recovery partition? And there have been some people that don't have one. And I will say this, just create it like I did in this video, how when I recreated it for how it was in the beginning for some people, and I just showed recreating it. Just follow the same steps, except you don't need to delete a recovery partition. You can just simply create one by shrinking the disk by like 750 megabytes and then doing the commands, and you'll be good to go, and then you'll have a recovery. Question number 3, if your recovery is on the C drive and you want to move it back to the recovery partition, how do you do that? I think it's, pretty similar to before. I think you mount the recovery partition and then you run the command to set the location for it, but instead of having it be C, I think you change C to Z, and I think that does work. I've not tested it, but you're pointing it towards the recovery partition, so if it's mounted, you should in theory be able to point it there. So just change the drive letter simply, and I believe that will do the trick. Alright, so I'm going to be going over a couple comments of a few isolated issues that I might know the solution to. I've not tested anything, nor have I ran into these issues, so I'm going to try my best to help you guys fairly quickly on what could be the problem. So this is a comment I got. Someone tried to create the partition with the GPT command. They got an error saying the arguments are not valid for this command. I think where you might have went wrong is the fact it's saying the arguments are not valid. I have a feeling your disk is not GPT. Your disk is probably MBR. So I would highly recommend trying the commands for MBR, and I did show in my video how to do it for MBR. So feel free to follow that and see if those commands work, as it seems like you might have created the wrong partition type on accident. So it seems a few people ran into this issue where diskpart would give an error when trying to format the partition, saying the parameter is incorrect. Now, I have actually not ran into this problem, and I feel like this error is not specific whatsoever, which is kind of odd that it's not formatting. So I would maybe check, did the partition create? Because maybe it doesn't realize what you're formatting, maybe you have the wrong thing selected, maybe there's a typo somewhere, but This error is just unfortunately not very specific for me, and I don't know why it's happening, and that's my guess, is that maybe there is no partition, maybe it failed to create, and then you tried to run the format command, and then it gave this error. I've not tested it, but that could potentially be the reason. But if you guys want to personally reach out to me about this, feel free to do that, and I'll try and help. Oh, and it does also mention to check the log, so you guys could also check the log too and see if that has anything useful, but I'm not sure how useful that log is going to be. But it looks like it'll be under Event Viewer under the System tab, and you should be able to find it from there. Alright, so the next error, someone tried to shrink their drive, and it said that it could not be shrunk because the file system does not support it. I believe this person did reach out to me, and it was because they selected the HP Tools partition that HP created, and it was a FAT32 partition, and you cannot shrink a FAT32 partition, so just be sure you're selecting the right partition when you're doing this, and be sure to select your main operating system partition instead, and shrink that, as you don't want to select the wrong partition, because as you know, partition numbers do vary between configurations, and yeah, that's important to look at when you're doing partitioning stuff. Now this one's a fairly quick one to solve. This person tried to delete the recovery partition, but they didn't specify override, and because they didn't do that, Windows saw it as a protected partition and wouldn't let them delete it. So just, again, double check the commands you're doing and make sure that you type them correctly. You'll not cause any harm by using override on the recovery partition, as it's actually not a required partition to boot. You can actually have Windows without a recovery partition and it'll be perfectly fine. It's just Windows categorizes it as a protected partition, so that's why you have to specify override, so don't be afraid of it. You'll be fine and nothing will go wrong. Also, I noticed in your case you have 2 recovery partitions, so I would be sure recovery is disabled first. Delete the partition 1 recovery like you were trying to do, and then re-enable recovery on that partition 5. It should just automatically default to it when you run the enable recovery command, and see if you can get the update installed, because that size might actually be enough because it's a bit larger than the default, as the default is around 500 megabytes, so you might get lucky, but if not, just delete that and recreate it. Anyways, guys, that wraps up this follow-up video, and I hope that these solutions help you guys for all the people in the comments that had issues, because some of these were extremely common, some of them were not as common, plus I talked about, some questions and a couple isolated issues. So if any other issues arise, which I'm sure will, because now that I have some new fixes out, I feel like some of these might have issues for people now, so feel free to leave comments on any issues you guys might encounter in this video, and I will try and help you out in the comments, or you can contact my social medias in the description below. So thanks for watching. This video took me several hours to make and a lot of time, that's for sure, and I really hope that it helps you all out. So hope you guys have a good one. Bye bye for now.